Hi, Dr. Scott Jensen here. Last week I provided an update regarding some of the court proceedings in terms of my lawsuits against the Attorney General Keith Ellison in the State District Court and my lawsuit against the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice in the Federal District Court. We have received partially the information from the Attorney General's office that we think we're entitled to receive. You see, I've submitted a Data Practices Act request that calls for me to receive all public information that the Attorney General's office has in regards to anything that has my name on it. Correspondence, information, emails, things like that, particularly from the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice, because the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice is being represented by the Attorney General. But I want to just give you a brief sort of picture of what exactly is going on here. So the Board of Medical Practice investigated me 6 different times, 18 allegations. The Attorney General is representing them, and the Attorney General's office is saying that they're not going to turn over to me all the information that we want because they think that it's potentially problematic, that if I receive information from them and talk about it in the public square, that they may get harassed or something like that. But there's thousands and thousands of pages involved, and we've been sifting through it, and particularly after last week's day in court, we felt we were given a little bit of a hint where we could go to get information that we didn't necessarily appreciate. We want all the information, but the Attorney General's counsel was helpful in terms of saying that there's numerous sources of information and we could get it from different places. And that helped me go back to some areas that I needed to really investigate. And now, after going through thousands of pages of information from the Attorney General's office and the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice, I want to share with you what constituted the first investigation against me way back in June of 2020. I've got it right here. This is what it took for me to get investigated. Now, please, without meaning to sound boastful, I just want to remind you that I've never been investigated by the Board of Medical Practice in more than 3 decades of medical practice. I had been a professor at the medical school in good standing for decades. I was the Minnesota Family Physician of the Year in 2016. But in 2020, approximately 2 months after I spoke out on the issues of COVID and the fact that I had concerns regarding numerous things, including the lockdowns, including the way death certificates were being completed, including some of the public policies. Approximately 2 months after I spoke out, all of a sudden I was being investigated. And here now I have the paper in front of me, providing me backstory that I never received from the Board of Medical Practice previously. Now I have the actual complaints, though they have had the names of the complainants redacted. But here's what it says. I would like to report a physician who is giving reckless advice over social media. Okay, that's the first one. And then that person goes on to submit a DFL press release hit piece and says, someone should really be looking into the reckless advice he's giving over social media. This is a doctor and therefore should be held to a higher standard. Now, that was May 10th of 2020. 3 days later, May 13th, 2020, another complaint. I don't know if it's the same person or not, but here's what it says. I would rather file anonymously if that's an option. The person I'm filing a complaint against is a Minnesota senator, and I would really not get involved with anything against him. And then it says this, an MD saying COVID-19 is nothing more than the flu. That right there is the context of the complaints. So I received the complaint at the end of June of 2020. I never saw this before. The complaint I received says, allegation number 2, it is alleged that you also provided reckless advice over social media, stating that COVID-19 is nothing more than the flu. Okay, reckless advice over social media, that was the first one I mentioned, and then is nothing more than the flu. So my first investigation by the Board of Medical Practice, allegation number 2, comes from these 2 complainants. Okay, so the first one said, I'd like to report a physician who's giving reckless advice over social media, and then lists a tweet. So here's the tweet. I found the tweet, and here's what I said. I said, a pessimist sees a lethal epidemic threatening the human race. An optimist sees just one more challenge for an ever-expanding immune capability. A realist sees a flu-like illness. That's what I said. That's what I said. I never said that this is nothing more than the flu. I didn't say that this was reckless or anything. I just said a realist sees a flu-like illness. Okay, that was a tweet. Well, then also I mentioned that the same person then submitted a copy of a DFL or a political hit piece. And in this hit piece, it's a press release from the Democrats. It says, on one page, it says, DFL party responds to Doubt's promise to block bonding bill. There was a representative, Kurt Doubt, who had evidently promised to block a bonding bill, and so they're going after him on that. And here's another one. DFL party responds to Pence's, that'd be Vice President Mike Pence, refusal to wear a mask to Mayo Clinic. And then it says, paid for by the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party. And then at the bottom, it's got DFL and says, get involved, contribute. That was what they submit. And there was a headline about me. So there was a tweet and a DFL hit piece. That's what constituted the first debate, the first investigation. So what had the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice executive director say about social media in terms of using that to investigate doctors? Well, in 2018, in early February, speaking to a Rotary Club in Bloomington, the executive director of the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice says, as she was asked a question about the role of social media, she said, social media for us as a board is not something that we rely upon in the investigative process. We also have very strict limitations on how we use information that comes from social media. So that's what the executive director said 2 years earlier. And I just read to you the tweet that I said, a flu-like illness. And the complaint says that I said it was nothing more than the flu or giving reckless advice over social media. So we have a political hit piece and a tweet that is misrepresented in the complaint itself. And yet I had to respond, took days and days, and submitted 70 pages. What did I say in my response in early July to the Board of Medical Practice? I said, allegation number 2, it is alleged that you also provided reckless advice over social media stating that COVID-19 is nothing more than the flu. I said this, the CDC reported the following on June 14th, 2020. Now, this was a month or 6 weeks after the complaint. The CDC had said this, for many people, being sick with COVID-19 would be a little bit like having the flu. Most people who have gotten COVID-19 have not gotten very sick. That was what they said 5 or 6 weeks after that complaint. And I then also quoted Dr. Anthony Fauci in the New England Journal of Medicine editorial on March 26, 2020, which would have been about 5 or 6 weeks before. So I gave them something before 5 or 6 weeks and something after 5 or 6 weeks. So the before 5 or 6 weeks was Tony Fauci saying this in the New England Journal of Medicine. Quote, this suggests that the overall clinical consequences of COVID-19 may ultimately be more akin to those of a severe seasonal influenza. So here we have it. First time in my life I'm investigated, and it's based on a tweet and a hit piece. That's all it took. And the tweet, where I used the phrase flu-like illness, was misconstrued to say that I was saying there was nothing more than the flu. And together, those two documents were all that were being put forth to provide any substance to the notion that I was reckless. That's really all I have to say about this, is that a tweet and a hit piece was enough to get me investigated. I'd have to ask you the same question. Would you potentially be susceptible to just as casual an investigation? If you work in a business or operate a business that calls for any kind of government agency to inspect you, to license you, to register you, to provide approval, to give you a permit to occupy that space, to do whatever you do, could you be just as casually investigated? Could you see some governmental agent or agency weaponized against you because someone might not like the things you say in the public square? We're getting more and more information now in this lawsuit. And what I've learned over the last few days, it was the only thing necessary for me to be called on the carpet, have my license investigated, was a tweet that was misconstrued and a hit piece. You think I'm disgusted?